Hello, today we're going to be talking about picking a shutter speed to remove camera shake forever. We've talked about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO and how to control your exposure with those elements, but now we want to make sure everything is sharp and we don't want to take ourselves out of the equation. This whole lecture is talking about handheld photographs. If you're on a tripod, this won't apply as much or at all, depending what you're shooting and what the settings are on your camera. So keep in mind this is kind of for your street photography or portraits as you're walking around with clients. If you're doing architecture on a tripod or anything on a tripod, you're not going to need to know this. So you should probably skip this video and run for the hills. So, one thing I want to clarify first is the difference between focus and camera shake with your images. They're two separate things that result in blurriness, but they're not the same cause. So we want to make sure to figure out, is it the fact it's not in focus or is camera shake the issue here? So I have some examples. This image here is out of focus. I did not pick the focus point, and the camera didn't catch up at the same time. It's always nice to blame your equipment, right? But when I shot this image, the focus just hadn't snapped in yet, so I got this nice, although wonderfully composed photo, but very blurry image, which didn't work out. Client ended up using it because it was a nice kind of background image for their website, and it kind of played in our favor. Happy accidents. But this is an example of an out of focus image. This is an example of camera shake. So camera shake is defined because it's got some sharp elements to it, but they're typically dragged across the frame. You can see there's a little bit of movement to this where like the grass and the tree was pulled down as the camera was moving. The photo was being taken, which is what results in this kind of streakiness look. And that's what we know as camera shake. Streakiness isn't always straight lines. It could be wobbly in a circle. A square if your hand's in motion is really funny, but you have to think organically as humans, it's going to be some smooth motions going up or down in some kind of tornado fashion. So how do we avoid this? There's a rule of thumb for shutter speed that all photographers used from the inception of kind of film days, and that's what I'm going to talk about first, and then we're going to go into how that applies to digital. So the rule of thumb is 1 over your focal length is what your shutter speed should be. So for example, if you've got your camera sent to 30 millimeters, here on my camera, I'm just going to switch over. This is about 30 millimeters on my focal length. Focal lengths are usually noted on your zoom ring here on your camera. If you're not sure where that is, you can kind of make a guess, or when the photo's taken, you'll see afterwards on the computer what says 30 millimeters. But in our case, it's listed on my lens here. So if your camera is set to 30 millimeters for your focal length, you should be shooting at least 1/30th a second for your shutter speed. You can go faster. You can go 1/60th, 1/125th, 1/250th, 1/1000th of a second, but your minimum shutter speed should be at least 1 over your focal length, in our case 30 millimeters, so 1/30th of a second. And the reason this works this way, kind of the exotic thing of, ooh yes, switching transitions here on OBS. The reason this works is because the further away your zoom is, the more change there is if there's an adjustment from your hands moving. So if your camera is like this, you can do this at home and follow along and feel stupid in your apartment like I do right now. If you have your camera really close to your face in terms of zoom, and say this is 30 millimeters, I can see everything here. So just a 1 degree difference doesn't change things too much. If I put my fingers out, which we're faking kind of a zoom here, if I put my fingers this far out and say we're at 200 millimeters and I just move my fingers and you look through that box like 1 degree, there's a huge difference in terms of how much camera movement is happening. So that's why when you zoom, changing your shutter speed matters, because a tiny little movement at 200 millimeters is a big change, but a tiny little movement at 30 millimeters isn't as drastic in changing what's in the frame. So again, look through your fingers here, little movement, out here, big movement, even if it is the same distance / degree I'm roughly doing in this wonderful example here. Okay, so it's 1 over your focal length for a full frame sensor. Now the thing is, if you just started in photography and didn't drop like 4 figures on a camera, you might have a crop sensor inside your camera, and that means your focal length on your lens is probably lying to you. This is the one thing that camera manufacturers don't really communicate to their customers, but it's a reality of how optics and math work and how the sensors are manufactured. So what that actually means is on a full frame sensor, we've got the sensor on the left-hand side here, big chunky thing. It goes through the front of the lens, and you're shooting a very big giraffe on the right-hand side. And that's great. The whole giraffe is in the frame. We've got the top of its head, horns, and ears, all the way to its feet. It's everything the camera can actually see when the field of view is coming into the camera. The thing is, camera manufacturers want a lot of people to buy cameras. So the best way to make cameras more affordable for people is to make a smaller sensor. So if you make the sensor smaller, but the lens is the same distance from that sensor, what happens is it actually extends the focal length of your actual, on your lens. So if you had a 50 millimeter focal length on your lens and you had a 2 times, we'll call it a crop frame or your crop factor, it's actually going to display as a 100 millimeter lens. So again, you're getting that extension, which can be great for kind of sports or if you're doing any telephoto work with wildlife and things like that. Not so helpful in architectural, but that's going to impact how we change our shutter speed for that particular shoot. So here, as you can see, the crop frame sensor tighter, and then we're losing the giraffe right above its neck and below its ankles. So if it's wearing really cool shoes, we're not going to get a photo of that, and the shutter speed we're going to have to use to capture this correctly without any camera shake is going to change. This is probably the most technical part I'll do on a YouTube video, hopefully for you, because I know everybody's not a big fan of math, but I am. We're going to walk through this really quickly. 18 to 55 millimeters on the left-hand side, that's going to be your pretty standard lens that you get if you buy your camera from any kind of box store or your local kind of like multi-purpose drugstore in your area. An 18 to 55 millimeter lens with no sensor crop, say it's a full frame, you're going to shoot that at 1/60th of a second because the longest focal length you'll have on that is 55 mil. There's no 1/55th of a second on shutter speed, so the closest one we can get to is 1/60th of a second. If, however, you have that same lens on a crop sensor, and let's say the sensor crop is 1.6, which is not uncommon, every camera is going to be different, so you're just going to have to Google this for yourself. Sometimes it's 1.0, which is a full frame, 1.3, 1.6, 2 times even. It depends between manufacturer and the brand of camera. Everybody has a little bit of a different approach to this to make a smaller sensor to make the camera more affordable and easier at an entry level for people to reach that price point. So we take this second hypothetical camera here, it's got an 18 to 55 millimeter lens on it, and the crop factor is 1.6. That lens actually isn't an 18 to 55 millimeter lens, it's a 29 to 88 millimeter lens, because again, 1.6 times 18 is 29, and 55 times 1.6 is 88. That's all the math we need to do tonight. Yay, done. So we take those numbers, we take the longest focal length you can do, which is 88 millimeters in this case, and we need to shoot at least 1/90th of a second to make sure we take our hands out of the equation. That's what we're fighting with. We're organic human beings that are not made out of pure metal yet. Give it time. Thanks, Elon. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of movement because we breathe, we sigh, we kind of fidget. So once we get a fast enough shutter speed, we're taking ourselves out of the equation. The camera's going to shoot a photo fast enough that no matter how much we're moving, within reason, like don't shake your camera and then apply this rule that, Curtis, you lied to me, betrayal, it's going to take those minor movements out of there so you can ensure you're going to get a sharp image with your camera. If you don't want to Google things and you're like, Curtis, this is all way too much math for me, you can just take that simple 1 over focal length rule and just double it. So if you're shooting at 30 millimeters, shoot at 1/60th of a second. So rather than 1/30th of a second, just double that and say 1/60th. You'll definitely be safe in that regard, removing camera shake from your images. What you might lose is a little bit of extra light coming into the camera in terms of low light situations. So that's why following the exact rule helps. But if you're shooting daylight or street photography anywhere between kind of 9 to 5 in the day and not dealing with lack of light, you can afford to kind of lose that little bit of light you would get by doing this equation or Googling yourself. So 1 over your focal length, and when in doubt, just double that 1 over 2 times your focal length. I lied about being done with math. Apologies. Anyhow, I hope that helps you get more sharp images, and try it for your next shoot. Figure out for your different lenses what you should be shooting at. This might have been something that's resulting in bad images so far, and this is going to solve all your problems moving forward. You only need to figure this out once for each lens that you have, and then it's off to the races for the rest of your shooting experience. All right. Thanks so much for listening.